Welcome to Country Over Self, Defining Moments in American History. Each episode, we welcome a notable historian to tell us the story of a president and a choice that president made to strengthen the country without regard to the impact of that decision on himself, his power, or his party.
Welcome to Country Over Self, Defining Moments in American History. I'm your host, Matt Blumberg, and I'm here today with Mark Updegrove. Mark is the president and CEO of the LBJ Foundation and serves as a presidential historian for ABC News. But we're not talking about LBJ today. Mark is the author of 5 books on the presidency, including The Last Republicans, Inside the Extraordinary Relationship Between George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. Mark, welcome to Country Over Self.
Thanks so much, Matt. Delighted to be here.
Great. So today we want to talk about our 41st president, George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., Bush 41, Poppy, depending on who you talk to. Bush had one of the most impressive kind of pre-presidential resumes in our country's history. Member of Congress, chair of the RNC, ambassador to the UN, envoy to China, director of the CIA, 2-term vice president, before winning the presidency in 1988. Bush is one of 15 vice presidents who has gone on to become president and is one of only 4 who won that election as a sitting vice president, Adams, Jefferson, and Van Buren as the other 3, noting that very long gap between Van Buren and Bush. I would say Bush's term in office is probably best remembered for shepherding us through the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. His post-presidency I think was probably best defined by 2 things. One was the extraordinary relationship he developed with Bill Clinton, the person who defeated him for re-election, and that he was one of only 2 presidents to see his son win the presidency. So I've been excited to talk about Bush 41 on this show, and I'm really happy you're here. And there are sort of 2 defining moments that I want to talk about, but the one that I really want to go deep on is something with the very dry name of the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990. So Mark, let's start with that. What's sort of the decision point or defining moment that we're talking about today?
Well, you have to go back to the campaign of 1988, as you said, that there was no incumbent vice president who had risen to the presidency since Martin Van Buren had succeeded Andrew Jackson in the 1800s. So there were a lot of eyes on the 1988 race. Of course, Bush had been, as you suggested, Matt, the 2-term vice president for Ronald Reagan. But there was a lot of wariness about Bush and the Republican Party. Ronald Reagan was a bona fide conservative. He was trusted by the conservatives, the evangelistic community, which helped get him into office, and the various constituents around conservatism really lined up behind Reagan's candidacy. But they were wary of Bush 41 as a sort of closet moderate, and not even so closeted, sort of a Rockefeller rather Republican. And there was a great deal of pressure on him not to raise taxes. There was a movement at the time led by a gentleman named Grover Norquist not to raise taxes. And Bush said at the convention patently, in order to engender the trust of Norquist and that very powerful constituency and other powerful conservatives, read my lips, no new taxes. He said, I'll be pushed and I'll be pushed and I'll be pushed, but I will not yield. And that line stuck. Read my lips, no new taxes. But as you suggested, there was a budget struggle in 1990. The House was controlled by Democrats. And in order to get the deal through, Bush had to raise taxes. It wasn't a major tax increase. In fact, Reagan had approved tax increases during the course of his administration, which were much greater than the tax increase that Bush allowed in order to get the budget through. But it violated that very public promise that he would not raise taxes. And it proved very controversial. Those wary conservatives sort of called him out on this, and it hurt his candidacy tremendously. So We go back to 1990, he yields on this. And I think that domestic compromise in order to get the budget through, which ended up being incredibly valuable to growing the economy during the course of the Clinton administration, probably made the difference for Bush in earning him another term as president.
I had to remind myself of some of the details on this in preparation for this conversation, and one of the things that I had forgotten was, obviously he knew this was going to be an issue, and I can't remember whether it was in your book or in John Meacham's book that he said to the Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, at the time, Lord, I've got 2 years to recover from this grief. The main thing is to get the job done. And then I think at the announcement, he said, sometimes you don't get it just the way you want, but it's time we put the interest of the United States of America first and get this deficit under control. And the thing that I found so interesting was that the first pass at the bill raised some peripheral taxes, but no income taxes. And he got so much grief from the Republican caucus, some of whom had been in the room negotiating with him. And he got so much grief from them for pursuing deficit reduction, which was Republican orthodoxy at the time as well, that they bolted on the bill, and he didn't have enough support to do it without raising income taxes slightly.
That's absolutely right. But it bears mentioning here, and this is really key, that he loses the presidency to Bill Clinton in 1992, and Clinton goes on to oversee during his 2 terms in office the most prosperous U.S. economy in the history of our nation, and ends up delivering 4 consecutive budget surpluses at the end of his term, and leaves with an approval rating of 64%, despite the scandals in his administration. That's all because the economy was so solid at that time. And so much of that has to do with the compromise that Bush made in 1990s. So what ended up being enormously controversial and may have cost, or at least in part cost, Bush the presidency, ends up being enormously beneficial for the country that George H.W. Bush so loved. And he ends up getting the Profile and Courage Award from the JFK Foundation. There's pretty prestigious stuff because of the political courage it took to make that deal for the good of the nation, as you suggested.
And, it's interesting to have this conversation with the backdrop of today's political environment where, sort of any compromise with the other side is vilified by the extremes of both sides. This is a long time ago. And, in the Reagan administration, there was plenty of compromise. Do you feel like the seeds of today's environment were, sort of being planted at this moment in 1990, 1992? Or, what was going on? Why was it that deficit reduction and entitlement reduction with what proved to be a de minimis increase in taxes was so problematic for Bush with his own party?
I think you see increased conservatism, a different strain of conservatism beginning to emerge from the Republican Party. This refusal to pay any more taxes. That's a different sort of strain of conservatism. Reagan was against big government, but you saw during the course of his administration, actually government expanded. And to your point, Reagan made a lot of compromises with the other side. That's how you govern. Half a loaf is better than none, right? You meet in the middle. Depending on how you negotiate, it depends on where in the middle. But that's inherent in our democratic system. You have different people with different views who go to Washington to represent their constituents, and you negotiate. You try to figure out the best policy for all concerned. That's an inherent part of things. Things start changing in the 1980s. And I think I'm not sure I would point to the budget compromise that Bush makes in 1990. I think that's a reflection of this. But I think you probably have to go back to the changing media landscape and Reagan striking down the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. And overnight, you have talk radio become the number one form of radio. And this conservative talk radio, in particular with Rush Limbaugh and other far right figures. And then you get, I think, Fox News and this sort of extremism. And Bush is running into that to a large extent in 1990. And again, I think it proves his undoing. He's challenged by Ross Perot, a third-party candidate who ends up getting 19% of the vote in 1992. Clinton does not get a majority, but he earns the presidency because the conservative and Republican vote more broadly is split between these two candidates. Many Republicans, as I mentioned, simply they didn't trust Bush before, and they certainly don't trust him after he violates that pledge.
Yeah, the Perot part of the campaign is interesting because he didn't win any states, but he caused Clinton to win a bunch of states, and certainly in my lifetime, your lifetime, it's the most significant third party run that we've seen, and the most impactful one. Do you feel like it was the compilation of lots of things that led Perot to jump in? Or were there some flashpoints in it? Was this particular thing one of the flashpoints?
I think this is probably one of the flashpoints. But what Perot's candidacy shows is that populist candidates can catch fire. And he did. Captured the imagination of the American people. The American people thought he was one of them in a way. And that he would advocate for them in a way that George Herbert Walker would not. He, as you may recall, he got into the race and then he got out of the race and then he stepped back into the race. And there was this will he or won't he drama behind Ross Perot's candidacy. He was on Larry King Live and he said, I really don't want to run, but the people want me to run. They can sign a petition. And there was this great grassroots movement behind Ross Perot, because I think there were a lot of alienated conservatives who were looking for a candidate that they could get behind. And that's the reason that Ross Perot caught fire and the imagination of so many Republicans.
Yeah, and I mean, it's sort of interesting to think about the parallels between that and Trump. It certainly starts with the billionaire businessman outsider and populism and the right. And the distrust of compromise and moderates.
Yeah, and you talked about Bush's record. To some degree, that worked against him. He looked like the longtime politician, and the Bushes, as you know, Matt, were devoted to public service, and that can be a plus at times, but that can also be a minus because the American people say, "Look, we're tired of this inside the Beltway stuff. We want an outsider to come in and fix it all." And that explains why Ross Perot was so popular in 1992. It explains the rise of Donald Trump, this outsider who doesn't have any military or political experience, but casts this image of somebody who can fix it all because he knows it all, right? And he played that role on television, and people thought he could play that role in the White House.
You talked a little bit about sort of the impact of the decision, and that it sort of opened the door to budget surpluses, an incredibly strong economy. There's certainly other things in the Clinton administration going on, like the rise of the internet, that probably led to strengthen the economy. But that was clearly one of the things. How do you think that decision around the budget compromise impacted history other than sort of the economy under Clinton? Like, have there been echoes and reverberations? Did it, maybe fuel further distrust of moderates on the right?
I think that's probably right. I mean, it changes history because it really changes the political prospects for George Herbert Walker Bush, right? Bush may well have gotten another term. That's interesting. Bush did so well on foreign policy, and I think you alluded to, I think that the main pillar of his legacy, Matt, which is that the Cold War ended with a whimper and not a bang. You had no shots fired, no tanks in the street, no bloodshed. As the Cold War wound down, and there was no assurance of that. This is the dominant geopolitical issue for 40 years in American politics. And the fact that it ended so peacefully with the transition of so many nations toward democratic systems of government is a testament to the sheer competence of George Herbert Walker Bush and the people around him, the very able team around him. But so you get the Gulf War, which is resolved expeditiously and with a very clear exit strategy. After the Cold War ends peacefully, you get the reunification of Germany, you get the establishment of a new world order. These are major accomplishments, remarkable accomplishments from a foreign policy standpoint. But what Bush did not have is he didn't have a view for what his domestic policy would look like. And I think Americans, at a certain point after the Gulf War, Bush has an approval rating of 89%. That's astronomical, right? But he did not tell people what he was going to do in domestic policy, and elections are forward-looking. They don't look backward. We don't give credit to the president for what he has done. We're looking for what he will do. And Bush didn't articulate very clearly a domestic policy that would resonate at kitchen tables throughout the United States. In fact, on the contrary, Bush looked like he was out of touch. Had he been a better communicator, a Reagan-esque or Clintonian kind of communicator, he might have articulated to the American people why that tax compromise was beneficial. But he was unable to do that. And the combination of all those things meant the defeat of Bush in 1992. I would add, though, Matt, that I think he's probably the most important one-term president in the history of our country. That could change if Kamala Harris prevails in the election early next month. Then I think Joe Biden will probably be the most significant one-term president. But that's no mean feat. George Herbert Walker Bush had an enormously consequential 4 years in office, despite being defeated at the polls in 92.
So I want to move and talk a little bit about his legacy, and I want to start this by going through a sort of second defining moment, and that moment is the letter that he left behind in the Resolute desk in the Oval Office on Clinton's inauguration day. And I actually want to read the text of the letter, and it's short enough because it's one of those things that sort of gives me the chills when I read it. When I actually went to the Clinton library recently, and I couldn't find it there, and I assumed it would be there because I feel like it's such an important document. But the letter reads, "Dear Bill, when I walked into this office just now, I felt the same sense of wonder and respect that I felt 4 years ago, and I know you'll feel that too. I wish you great happiness here. I never felt the loneliness some presidents have described. There will be very tough times, made even more difficult by criticism you may not think is fair. I'm not a very good one to give advice, but just don't let the critics discourage you or push you off course. You will be our president when you read this note. I wish you well. I wish your family well. Your success is now our country's success. I'm rooting hard for you. Good luck, George." And what's so interesting to me when I read this letter is Bush wasn't the first president to leave his successor a note, and he's not going to be the last. But the note stands out to me as a defining moment in American history, especially as we talk today so much about the peaceful transfer of power, because Bush actually lost the election to him. And it was such an incredibly gracious note. And I'm rooting hard for you, and your success is now our country's success. So my question to you, as someone who's actually spent time with Bush 41 and the Bush family, how did he think about his legacy and his reputation? And why do you think this letter was important for him?
Well, let me answer your question, but let me give you a little context on this letter. First of all, I think your viewers will forgive me for 1 sec. I have that letter here. I think this is here. Let me see. Yeah, I have that letter here. And the reason is that I asked Bill Clinton about this, and I asked Bill Clinton in an interview with ABC to read this letter. We were doing an interview with him anticipating the death of George Herbert Walker Bush, who had then become, as you suggested earlier, a dear friend of Bill Clinton's. And he read it, and it was really moving. And I'll tell you why that letter is not in the Clinton library. It's because it's in the possession of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton likes to take that letter out and read it every now and again. And it was profoundly moving to him to get this letter from his predecessor. And you're right. Ronald Reagan had established the tradition of leaving a letter for his successor. But in Clinton, in Reagan's case, it was really easy to do that, right? He's being succeeded by his vice president and his heir apparent. So that's a slightly different proposition than leaving a letter for the person who has defeated you in a campaign where the elbows got pretty sharp at times, right? So it's a remarkable thing. And it is a testament to George Herbert Walker Bush, who never failed to put country above party and above self. That is really an implicit American value, and one that we hope all presidents abide by. That, to your point, is a manifestation of that, not only of I think what democratic values are, but really the ethos of the Bush family, thinking about the other guy, thinking about the greater good. That's part of the Bush family ethos. George Bush would talk about his mother, lecturing him. I don't want to know how you did on the baseball team, George. How did the team do? So he was really taught to think about the greater good. He had high ambitions himself, and there are times during the course of his political career where he lets his ambitions exceed his grace, but not for very long. And this is a great example of Bush doing the right thing. In terms of his legacy, he didn't talk about that. Bush would talk about his legacy as the L word. And it's very telling that he didn't write a memoir, those self-serving memoirs that presidents churn out inevitably. He did have All the Best, which is a book of letters that he had written during the course of his life, which are very revealing of his character. He wrote a book with Brent Scowcroft about the foreign policy crises that they faced during the course of their administration. But he didn't write a memoir because that was not Bush's style. He was taught really not to think about himself in grandiose terms. So it's characteristic for him not to think about legacy. That said, Matt, I used to talk to him about his legacy frequently, and I would say, you're one of the few presidents who will ever see in his lifetime a pretty clear indication of how history will reflect on your administration and your life, because there was sort of a period at the end of the sentences that had began during the course of the administration. There was a finality to the things that he was dealing with. We talked about the budget compromise, which again paved the way for the prosperity of the Clinton years in large measure, but also a resolute end to the Gulf War, an end to the Cold War. Again, I mentioned earlier the reunification of Germany. There were no messy loose ends, and he could hand the presidency over to Clinton, who would have a fresh start. Right, there was a clean break. So I think that's part of the legacy of Bush, and I was really pleased to see somebody who had been defeated for re-election see that his administration was being reflected very well in American history at the end of his life.
Yeah, I think very, very much so, and I think it grows over time still.
Yeah, I agree, but partly because of the character of Bush, not only because of the accomplishments of the administration, which are formidable, they really are. Particularly that Cold War thing, which has so much to do with Bush's humility. Bush refused to spike the football or beat his chest about the triumph of American ideals over totalitarianism. He didn't want to compromise the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev at a time when they really needed to negotiate certain things in order to ensure that there was greater democracy in the eastern part of the world, right, with the Eastern Bloc nations and in Russia. So that becomes vitally important at that moment. So that humility, which is so endemic to his character, becomes an important part of his legacy.
Yeah. All right. So I want to close with a few rapid fire questions. And the first two, let's limit ourselves to non-living presidents or former presidents. So the first question is, we talked about Bush 41 today. If you had to pick another example, since you've written books about lots of presidents, if you had to pick another example of a president choosing country over self, what would it be?
Yeah, there's so many, and we've had the this is rapid fire, so I'll answer quickly. I think you got to give LBJ enormous credit for pushing through the Civil Rights Act in 1964 after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had proposed the Civil Rights Act, hadn't put a lot of legislative might behind it, and LBJ comes into the presidency accidentally and immediately makes it a priority and pushes it into law. And his aides say, Mr. President, wait till you earn the presidency in your own right and then push it into law. And LBJ famously says, what the hell's the presidency for?
That is, in fact, the theme of the episode I recorded with Julian Zelzer. So That's perfect. So question two, let's ask the opposite. What's the best example or most prominent example in your mind of a president doing self over country?
There aren't that many. That's the good news. I got to say that the most egregious example of that is Donald Trump over and over and over during the course of his administration, putting himself above the needs of the country and any other consideration. There are numerous examples. I know that we have an election in a couple of weeks, and many of your listeners and watchers may be casting their vote for Donald Trump, but I see in him a constitutional inability to think of anything beyond himself. There's a sort of malignant narcissism that I think was pervaded his first administration.
Is there one you can think of that's further back in the past?
The Alien and Sedition Act from John Adams comes to mind. This is somebody who had a thin skin, much like Donald Trump, and put something in place that was draconian to prevent dissent, voices of dissent from playing out. And thankfully, although we were a fledgling nation, people were, committed to the democratic values that were espoused by our founders. And John Adams, the first one-term president, albeit one like George H.W. Bush, who had been a vice president and an incumbent vice president and earned the presidency, he was roundly criticized for it. And it probably, it was one of the things that cost him his second term. And he lost, of course, to our third president, Thomas Jefferson, his vice president.
All right, my third rapid fire question you half answered earlier in the conversation, and that's about Biden and his withdrawal from the race. And what you said earlier was if Harris wins, that his presidency will be viewed as a very consequential one-term president. What do you think happens to his legacy if Harris loses?
It's still significant insofar as he's the most significant legislative president since Lyndon Johnson. The infrastructure stuff in particular is really important. And this is a guy who understood the legislative process much as Lyndon Johnson did and was able to get some significant legislation through at a time, unlike Lyndon Johnson, when partisanship really marks the attitude of Washington. It is so pervasive and so dominant. It was difficult to manage those legislative feats. So that's an impressive accomplishment. But really, the central pillar of Joe Biden's legacy, and the reason he got into the race in the first place, was to fend off what he saw and many saw as an existential threat to democracy from Donald Trump. And he did so by defeating Trump in 2020, returning us to democratic norms and values, and doing things like reviving NATO, which was particularly important in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine. And I think part of that legacy is knowing that he wasn't the best standard bearer for the Republican or for the Democratic Party, and I think courageously yielding the torch and passing it to his Vice President Kamala Harris. If she wins, if she staves off this threat once again, I think there is no question in my mind that Joe Biden will, not only be the most important one-term president in the history of our country, but will be more than anyone else responsible for the preservation and protection of our democracy against this threat.
And what do you think happens if it goes the other way?
I think it depends largely on the Trump presidency, but we can predict, I think, based on the rhetoric that we're hearing, that we're going to take a very different turn in the United States. I think you can't blame Joe Biden for his age. You can give him enormous credit again for jumping into the race in 2019 and winning in 2020. But I think his place in history is compromised by not knowing earlier that he shouldn't run for a second term and trusting the party to go through a primary process that would yield a more viable candidate than himself.
All right, my final question for you. Knowing everything you know about our system, our politics, our culture, and you know more than most, if you could wave a magic wand and make one change to something in our system, regardless of what it requires, constitutional amendment, it's cultural, doesn't matter. You could wave a magic wand and change one thing to strengthen our system of government. What would it be?
Well, I alluded to it earlier. I think that the biggest threat to our government is our fragmented media system. And I mentioned Reagan striking down the fairness doctrine, which kept media outlets in check. And I think it would be something very big around ensuring that purveyors of media, whether it be social media or mainstream media, whatever it might be, are responsible for content that does not allow for misinformation and disinformation. I think that is the biggest problem. So I would have to look at what the best law might be.
The best path to that is, yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Because a lot's changed since the fairness doctrine was struck down.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. It is when the country can't agree on facts, it's a problem.
That's exactly right. And that could be the undoing of our democracy.
Yeah.
80% of Americans get their news from social media, and social media purveyors are not bound to the same rules and regulations as those in the mainstream media. So that would be my answer.
All right. Mark Updegrove, presidential historian, best-selling author. Thank you so much for joining me today on Country Over Self.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Country Over Self podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a minute to give us 5 stars and leave us a review. If you have an idea for an episode or want to reach Matt directly, please email podcast@countryoverself.com.